Welcome back to the Lowdown, everybody. The Premier League is back, and so are we. On today's show, we talk about players that will prove you wrong this season, kicking off with the Liverpool midfielder that has been reborn under Arne Slot.
With Gravenberch, when you watched him play at Ajax, he did actually look quite like Pogba in terms of the way he could glide through midfield.
The Chelsea player thriving for club and country this season.
And he was really positive on him. He described him as one of the best young forward players in Europe, if not the best.
And the Arsenal signing with a point to prove. I think was a fabulous deal, particularly with the loan with no obligation to buy. I can't really see a massive downside. Yes, welcome back to the Lowdown, everybody, where we're gearing up for the return of the Premier League. Saturday, 12:30, Man United versus Southampton. Delighted that it has returned. And then a huge game on Sunday, Arsenal versus Spurs, or Spurs versus Arsenal, because Spurs are, of course, the home side. Joining myself and Mikey today, we've got Nick Wright of the Sky Sports digital journalist, fame, features writer for Sky Sports. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Doogie. Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you. You said you've been doing some prep ahead of the North London derby.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, it's not looking great from Arsenal's perspective, isn't it, in terms of absentees with Martin Odegaard now probably going to, missing the game, as well as Rice, Mikel Merino out as well. So, probably the first choice midfield unavailable. So that's probably, probably gone down well with Spurs fans, not so well with Arsenal fans. But it should be a great game. I'll be there actually at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium to cover that on Sunday. So looking forward to that.
Love it. Yeah, should be absolutely epic as a contest. Today, on today's show, we are talking about the players that will prove you wrong this season. So these are maybe some players that didn't necessarily have the best campaign last year. We're expecting an improvement. And Mikey, I think it's only right to talk about one of the players who has been one of the stories of the season so far in Ryan Gravenberch. We spent weeks during the summer saying that if Liverpool were to sign anyone in any position, it would probably be a defensive midfielder. But so far, so good with Gravenberch at the wheel.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we first thought about this being the title of today's video, I just went to Gravenberch straight away, because I feel like he is the player who's more so than anyone else in the league is proving the doubters wrong, right? A few weeks ago, and still even now, to be fair, I think Liverpool fans, are right to be a bit disappointed with their summer window. A new manager coming in, and yet no starters through the door. Of course, great price for Federico Chiesa. Mamardashvili in the long term, amazing signing in terms of someone who could potentially, replace Alisson in years to come. But that lack of a number 6, the move for Zubimendi, which didn't come off, and the non-existence of a backup to Zubimendi, which we've seen so many times with Liverpool in terms of number 6s in the past, thinking Tchouaméni in particular back in 2022. I think it did raise a few alarm bells, and the fact that Arne Slot then had to almost kind of think on his feet a little bit. Of course, we saw him play, I think, 3 different number 6s in 3 consecutive games in pre-season, so we know that he was, already not necessarily set 100% on one player to play in that position. But I think you have to credit Arne Slot massively with the confidence which he's kind of shown to give Gravenberch the reins there. And I think he's he's been pretty remarkable. Of course, when we're speaking about all of these players, we do have to take into account it's only been 3 games.
It's a small sample size.
And there are going to be players who we speak about in this episode who haven't played significant minutes yet as well, who we're just expecting to have better seasons and to prove a few doubters wrong. But, when you look back to last season, ranked 18th for minutes played in the Liverpool squad, he only had 12 starts. He'd only made 3 starts the previous season for Bayern Munich. So really, since Ajax, Gravenberch has struggled for game time. First 2 seasons in the top 5 league as well. He's still incredibly young, but 40 million euros, on deadline day last term to go to Liverpool. He was signed for Bayern for, half that the year before. I think there was a fair amount of pressure on him in terms of living up to that, or there continues to be. But his underlying numbers just weren't great. His progressive pass numbers have always been pretty good throughout his career, and they were pretty good last season, but they were still a career low. He was below McAllister. Even Szoboszlai was completing more progressive passes in what was an up and down first season for him. Wasn't putting many balls into the final third, and I think that was mainly because Klopp was playing him in such an advanced position. He was taking up so many, positions kind of almost, in the left half space towards the opposition box. And I feel like Gravenberch, from a young age, actually, even when he was at Ajax, I think there was a danger that he was going to fall into the Paul Pogba kind of dilemma.
That's what they likened him to as well.
Yeah, massively.
The Dutch Pogba is what they always
and I
used
think,
to say.
And you think about so many players who have been compared to Pogba over the years, probably, mischaracterized as a new Paul Pogba. With Gravenberch, when you watched him play at Ajax, he did actually look quite like Pogba in terms of the way he could glide through midfields. He was so good in tight spaces. Also, when he went to put tackles in, they were always quite aesthetically pleasing, loved a little slide and whatnot, but equally was not the most active defender. Wasn't, whether that be through instruction or because he wasn't really that keen in terms of his defensive responsibilities, that was always something that was thrown at him, that he wasn't the best defender. And so when he came to Liverpool and, people were saying, oh, maybe he could be an option at 6, it never really sat great with me, especially given that, he was never trusted in a double pivot at Bayern Munich either. So there were lots of reasons to believe that Gravenberch wouldn't fully make it at Liverpool. And yet this season, he's been absolutely brilliant so far. And obviously in Arne Slot's system, it's a lot more based around possession. I think he put up the most passes in the Liverpool team against Brentford. And in that game, Liverpool sustained the highest pass percentage in any of their games of the last 20 years.
Wow.
And yet he's still putting in, I think he still put in 6 tackles and interceptions in that game. He put another 6 tackles and interceptions against Man United. And yeah, his defensive positioning, his defensive discipline has been absolutely crucial to Liverpool, being able to sustain pressure in games and relieve pressure on their back line.
And even though he's playing as a 6 as well, I think it was interesting in that United game in particular that a lot of his defensive work actually was in the opposition half, so he was quite aggressive and proactive in winning the ball back high up the pitch, despite the fact he's kind of ostensibly playing as the 6. So that's interesting as well. And I agree, on the ball, I think he's made a big difference. Arne Slot talks a lot about control, doesn't he? That's what he wants. He wants more control, and I think by using Gravenberch at 6, you get more out of him. You maximise his kind of passing ability, and that's definitely helped Slot so far, I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that McAllister's alongside him, who played in that position a lot last year as well, I imagine that helps. I mean, Nick, I was going to ask you, I don't know what you were thinking, where Liverpool would finish this season before a ball was kicked, but have you been pleasantly surprised by how seamlessly Slot has adapted to the Premier League? Aside from the first half of their opening game against Ipswich, I think they've been brilliant. Yeah,
they've been really good, haven't they? Better than I thought they would be. And certainly I think he's getting his messages across very quickly, and we're seeing evidence of what he wants to do much quicker than I thought we would. And obviously the results have been great. So yeah, I think it's really, really positive. And I'd say they've kind of outperformed my expectations so far. And yeah, I think Liverpool fans will be hoping they can sustain it and maybe put together some kind of title challenge. Maybe it's too early for that. That would be an amazing achievement to even challenge in the first season. But the squad is strong, isn't it? The team's really strong, and yeah, Slot's made a really positive impact so far.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he just speaks a lot of sense. He's not trying to replicate Jurgen Klopp in terms of the sort of extravagance of Klopp's language and the charisma of Klopp. I think he's very much trying to be his own man, which I think is been really, really important so far. And look, Man United were far from their best at Old Trafford, but to go there in your third game, win 3-0, as we discussed on last week's show, could have been a lot more decisive in that as well. I think it's been a super impressive start. Let's move on to one of the deals of deadline day, definitely one that was keeping us entertained across Sky Sports on that deadline day. Raheem Sterling to Arsenal. Now, this is really intriguing. I think from a financial point of view, and from pretty much every point of view, I think it's a really exciting signing for Arsenal. The fact it's a loan with no obligation to buy. They were kind of forced into this, Arsenal, given the fact that they did offload a number of bit part players, Eddie Nketiah, Emil Smith-Rowe, etc., Fabio Vieira during the summer. And now they are left with 20 outfield players, which it did feel a little short going into the season. But now, with a couple of injuries already racking up, there is a certain folly to that strategy, maybe. But there are injuries to Gabriel Jesus. Havertz, with Marino injured, was probably going to have to play a little bit more in midfield than maybe they planned for this season. So signing another forward on deadline day, I thought was really, really important. And to sign a right winger and a left winger, you can play on both sides, but to sign someone of Raheem Sterling's quality to play a backup role potentially, push Martinelli, who has kind of struggled really since the start of last season, and allow Trossard to play more centrally, and sign a player of Raheem Sterling's quality, I think was a fabulous deal, particularly with the loan with no obligation to buy. I can't really see a massive downside, especially because, according to reports, Arsenal are set to pay significantly less than 50% of his wages. It is fair to say, though, that he is under a little bit of pressure as a player. You know, that move to Chelsea in the summer of 2022 didn't work out as planned. He was a Thomas Tuchel signing. A lot of those Thomas Tuchel signings, when Chelsea hadn't established their sporting directors in Winstanley and Stewart in place, and Bolu was really calling the shots along with Tuchel having a much more significant role, they haven't really worked out. They've really been paying the price for that first summer ever since, really. Koulibaly, Aubameyang, Sterling, 19 goals and 12 assists in 81 games is not a disaster from Raheem Sterling, but it's certainly not the investment that they expected, and on huge wages as well, for £47.5 million in Sterling. I will caveat, though, with the fact that Sterling has had a difficult time in terms of the amount of managers he's had to play under. Potter, Tuchel, then Potter, then Lampard, then Pochettino. And he has had a couple of good spells in that. I think he started pretty well under Tuchel. There was also a spell, I think it was mid-October to mid-November last year, where he was playing pretty well under Pochettino. But Chelsea have just been signing at such a rate that if you aren't hitting the ground running, and players have played better for Chelsea in wide positions and in attacking positions than Raheem Sterling, maybe it was always inevitable that he was always going to be replaced, because since they've signed Raheem Sterling for that huge amount of money, Mudryk's come in, Madueke's come in, Joao Felix has come in twice, and Nkunku, Palmer and Pedro Neto. So, it was clear that as soon as it didn't work out as they expected, they have been trying to move on from him pretty fast. Chelsea fans will defend it, being like, he never lived up to expectations. He was on massive wages. They've clearly changed strategy to sign younger players on smaller wages spread across a longer period of time. And, he wasn't a Maresca player. I think there is the potential that he could really fire at Arsenal, though. I do. I mean, Arsenal, in terms of cutback goals last year, which is really what Raheem Sterling has been very good at providing and getting on the end of during his time at Man City, they were top in terms of cutback goals. He's also exceptionally good at winning penalties. In the last 10 years of the Premier League, he is tied first for winning penalties, along with Jamie Vardy. And that experience that he brings, having worked under Mikel Arteta, having scored over 10 league goals in 6 seasons, having contributed over 15 league goals in 5 seasons, I think he could really fire at Arsenal. And for this low risk, I think it is exciting. The one caveat which people come back to, Mikey and Nick, I don't know whether you want to dive in here, is that this was a guy that was a regular at 18, 19 in the Premier League. Yeah. I think by the age of 19, he played over 7,500 league minutes. And the average in Europe for a 19-year-old is just over 2. So there has been a lot of football in his legs, Mikey. And do you worry that this is a permanent decline, or was he just a victim of circumstance at Chelsea?
I think he's more of a victim of circumstance, if I'm honest. Like, I've not seen that much, and you may disagree, Nick, I don't know, but I've not seen that much in his, so-called decline at Chelsea to suggest that it's like a fitness thing or his legs are going. Like, he's still very quick. And, he may not be as quick as he was when he was like 21, but he was so fast at 21 that, even a drop off from that is still, higher than average. And we still saw pockets of him, being absolutely brilliant at Chelsea. I think this time last year, in those opening weeks where Pochettino's Chelsea looked pretty good actually on the whole, even if results were going against them, Sterling was probably their best attacker, certainly their most incisive. He still has that ability to break into the box, like you say, excellent penalty winner. So, yeah, I think under a fresh start for him and a winning side as well. When he joined Man City, they were already competing, at the top of the table even before Pep came in. I think joining a winning project, or say winning, Arteta hasn't won the Premier League yet, but a title challenging project with a manager he's familiar with, I think can only be good for him. And I guess, Nick, I guess you've been working on that, the Arsenal Spurs game, or Spurs Arsenal game, sorry, for this weekend. With those injuries, do you see Raheem Sterling starting potentially on Sunday?
Yeah, I think it's got to be fairly likely. I think he'll certainly be involved, but yes, his chances of starting are certainly increasing, and the more players become unavailable for Arsenal. I mean, I think it's interesting what you say about the minutes he's played for such a long period of time, and that's definitely a factor, isn't it, in how his career might go from this point onwards. I think from Arsenal's perspective, though, the fact they've got him on this loan deal, it's not really a huge concern for them, is it? Because right now, I think, as Mikey says, there's not obvious signs that he is in decline, really, physically. I think he's never been a player who covers an enormous amount of ground and who is, you know, super active off the ball in a defensive sense, but he's still, for me, doing the things that Raheem Sterling has always done. I think at Chelsea it has been hard for anyone to shine. You know, we've seen that over the last few years, and that even predates Sterling's arrival at Chelsea, just because of the kind of amount of change and turmoil there's been at Chelsea over the last few years. You know, you look at the current squad, and really only Cole Palmer has consistently excelled, and that's a bit of an anomaly, isn't it, really? So I think there are lots of reasons for Arsenal to be confident they can get more out of him, I think. And the one area where I do wonder is about maybe off the ball. You know, he's obviously fantastic in terms of his off the ball running in an attacking sense, and that can be a real weapon for Arsenal. But defensively, maybe he's not as naturally inclined to do the kind of hard yards that Gabriel Martinelli and Bukayo Saka do in that Arsenal team, or at least not to the same extent. So maybe that's something that Arteta will have to compensate for in other ways, or find a way around. But in terms of his attacking contribution, I think he can do some real damage for Arsenal. I think he'll get a lot of chances, and I think he can score a lot of goals. And yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see him feature against Spurs.
Yeah, absolutely. And with Martinelli having had a downturn in his output last year, you know, signing a player of his quality, I think it's really exciting. And, you know, it's only training videos, but he looks very, very sharp in training. Wasn't involved with England during the international break. Let's see what he can do. Right, Nick, let's move on to your first player. And it's a player very close to my heart as a Sunderland fan, and Amad Diallo. But he's got the potential to really establish himself at Man United this season.
Yeah, it looks that way, doesn't it? I mean, he was a massive signing, wasn't he, in 2021 under Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, £37 million fee to take him from Atalanta at only 18. I think a lot of people kind of raising their eyebrows at that fee, given, you know, he was still such a young player. But I think he would accept, and all Man United fans would accept, that it hasn't happened for him as quickly as they would like. You know, it was a kind of slow start for him. He had that loan spell at Rangers initially, which wasn't successful. He then went to Sunderland, which, as you know, Doogie, was very successful.
It was excellent.
He did very well. And that was a big, obviously really significant period for him to get up and running in English football, albeit in the second tier. And I guess the problem he had at Man United last season was coming back and getting injured in pre-season, so that kind of stalled him again.
Because he had played quite well in pre-season, I think.
Yeah, I think there was the feeling that maybe it was time for him to be integrated and start featuring, but that had to be pushed back. So it wasn't until the sort of latter stages of last season that he finally sort of started to get into that team and show signs of fulfilling his potential, which I think he is now doing. You know, there are positive signs, aren't there? I think in the last 8 games across the last 2 seasons, he's started 6, and in between those games, obviously, it was another impressive pre-season campaign. Erik Ten Hag has talked about this being his year, you know, the year for him to finally kind of show what he can do. I mean, he's still only 22, so, you know, we can't be too hard on him. But no, I think he can bring a lot to that team. You know, obviously in an attacking sense, they've struggled a bit, haven't they, United? And none of the other wide players are firing at the moment. You look at Garnacho, Rashford, they're all having a difficult time. I think Diallo is someone who's just bringing something fresh, very direct, dangerous, great in one-on-ones, explosive. Also, I think what's significant is he does have that creative capacity as well. You know, he's a good passer. And that is something I think Man United really need from their wide players. I think that's been a big issue for Rasmus Højlund there. He just doesn't get enough service. You know, 1.6 shots per 90 minutes from him last season, which was one of the lowest of any striker in the Premier League. And that reflects the lack of service he gets from Rashford and Garnacho, really, who are more inclined to shoot themselves. You know, they are goal scorers rather than goal providers, really. And you could argue that Diallo is a goal scorer more than a provider as well, but I think he is more inclined to kind of service others, and certainly his stats show that. If you look since the start of last season, and I should say that he's only played sort of 500-600 minutes, so we are talking about a small sample again, but he's only just behind Bruno Fernandes in terms of chances created from open play per 90 minutes. He's 1.93 is his number. Bruno's is 2.09. So, you know, he is giving the team a lot in a creative sense, and if you couple that with his one-on-one ability and his kind of goal threat that he carries himself, you know, I think there's potential there for a really big season, and certainly Man United need a spark and they need something different. And I think he was probably unlucky to not start in that game against Liverpool before the break. He won their Player of the Month award in August, and he was looking good. And Rashford and Garnacho didn't perform well in that game, so maybe he'll be back in the starting lineup after the break.
Fascinating against Southampton on Saturday. I was going to ask you, Mikey, does it feel like if Amad has the season that Nick is suggesting he could have and that we all kind of want to see from him, that it's really the final nail in the coffin of Antony as a Man United player. I know Antony is continuing to say, despite reports linking him with moves to Turkey this week, that he wants to stay at Man United. But this is another obstacle in his path, and it simply hasn't worked out.
Yeah, massively. I think, in some ways, that Amad's form going into this season and at the end of last season was kind of the final nail in the coffin for Jadon Sancho's Man United career, right? No matter what, personal differences he and Ten Hag may have had last season, if United went into this campaign without being confident of having, someone who could start on the right and produce, and I think, they wouldn't have had Amad's late season form not been so good last year, then I think the club may have been more inclined to keep hold of Sancho and see if they could, have one final crack at him. As for Antony, I think, at least as a squad player, I think he has a future in this United side, but certainly as a starter, it feels like his time is running out a little bit. Ten Hag put so much faith in him after signing him for so much money in 2022-23, put a lot of faith in him last year. I think there was very valid arguments that Amad should have been starting a lot earlier last season after coming back from that injury midway through the campaign. So yeah, I think it well could be, and especially given that Garnacho can play out there as well, as we saw against Liverpool, although he probably had his poorest United game in quite some time out there. But I think it is a really interesting point that you make, Nick, about the creativity. For years, United have lacked creativity on the wings. It's not really just been the last 2 or 3. Rashford has always been a goal scorer first and foremost, and Bruno Fernandes, before he came into that United side, there was almost no creativity in it whatsoever. And fast forward 4 years, and Bruno remains the only consistent creator in that side, and he's relied upon way too much. And I think it almost feeds into when we see United having a poor game, and you see the body language from Bruno, which is always picked up upon, and there's always a narrative around it as United captain. But you can kind of see why, because United always rely on him almost solely to make things happen in the final third. And not only that, they kind of rely on him to provide ball progression from deep when whoever's playing in midfield can't do it either. So he's always expected to kind of perform miracles for this United side when, there isn't really much else coming from it. If you've got 3 forwards who all rely on service to put them in behind from one player, then it's just, it's nowhere near, a good enough kind of recipe for sustainable success. So, I think if Amad can keep up this kind of creative form from the right, then I think we could see United's attack become a lot less predictable, I think, for opposition defences, especially once Højlund's back, especially once, Zirkzee is, again, not being relied upon so much as the centre forward, but can come on late in games potentially to make things happen, especially once Rashford finds his shooting form again. I do feel like it's inevitable that Rashford will start to finish chances better at some stage. So I think Amad, it could be a massive season for him.
Yeah, absolutely. They say you should never fall in love with a lone player. I certainly did. He was unbelievable for Sunderland. One of my favourite players in recent memory. And yes, our recent memory or recent times have not been particularly brilliant, but he was exceptional that year for sure. Let's move on to Spurs and talk about, we could have talked about Wilson Odobert, who I think a lot of people sort of went, what? When he signed from Burnley.
Big money as well.
Quite big money as well, but I don't want to heap too much pressure on him. Look, he's only 19. His last 2 professional seasons have been with Troyes and Burnley, obviously. So I don't want to put too much pressure on, but I think he's actually started really well and he can play on both sides. That's an exciting signing. But I think the player with maybe a little bit more to prove, just because I think there's so much quality there, is Dejan Kulusevski. He's 24 now and he's entering his 3rd full season at the club. He obviously joined in January 2022 and had that amazing start under Antonio Conte, a manager who had wanted him in previous job at Inter Milan, but never really got his man. But finally, Fabio Paratici landed him, Kulusevski, and it really went off like an absolute rocket. 5 goals and 8 assists in that half season. Since then, in his last 2 campaigns, 9 league goals and assists, 11 league goals and assists. And I think outside of Saka and Salah, who I think are in a sort of league of their own in the Premier League in terms of right wingers, I don't think there's too many more naturally gifted players than Kulusevski in that position. And I do think he should be providing more numbers. I do think he is a 15 league goals and assists guy at least every season. I don't see any reason why he can't get up there. His main issue at the moment is just simply volume of chances. We're talking about it with Rasmus Højlund, but of players to have scored over 10 league goals last year, which Kulusevski didn't do, there was only Højlund who averaged less than 1.9 shots per 90. Now, Kulusevski last year was at 1.7, and he is a brilliant provider of some creativity, particularly this season. I think he's started really, really effectively. But his main strength is actually getting into dangerous positions and receiving the ball in space. Only Bukayo Saka in the Premier League last year received more progressive passes than Kulusevski. And I just think he needs to be a little bit more selfish at times as well. And I think so much of the killer instinct at Spurs last year in particular was relied upon for Son, with Richarlison struggling. And now Dominic Solanke's been brought in, who is much more of a facilitator and a very good goal scorer than Richarlison. I hope we see Kulusevski take another step up. What is quite interesting about Kulusevski is that there is a bit of competition for places now in his positions. It feels like Ange Postecoglou really rates the fact that Brennan Johnson can take on opposition defenders on the outside and really likes the sort of cutbacks he can provide. Kulusevski's obviously going to more naturally inclined to cut in on his left foot. And if he's going to play more centrally, if Brennan Johnson's on the right, then you're coming into the position of Maddison. It's unlikely that you play probably Maddison and Kulusevski in midfield in the Premier League, unless it's very, easy opposition. And then they've just signed Lucas Bergvall as well, who's looked really promising so far, who's seen as kind of the James Maddison heir. So that's why I feel like we need to see the Kulusevski sort of leap forward this year. And I hope he gets the game time to do it, because I do really enjoy watching him play. I think he's technically absolutely brilliant, keeps hold of the ball really well, is not super explosive, but has reasonable acceleration to beat a man in shorter distances, but longer distances, I don't think his speed is quite there. But he's actually started the season really promisingly as well. He had a great pre-season, often playing as a striker because Richarlison was injured and Dominic Solanke was signed relatively late. And so far this season, he's actually started really well. So in terms of shot creating actions, which are shots or the pass before, which leads to a shot, only Savio is averaging more shot creating actions per 90 in the Premier League so far this season. And in terms of an international break as well, it couldn't really have gone much better for Kulusevski. He was absolutely amazing, captaining the side. They beat Azerbaijan 3-1. It's only Azerbaijan, but he created 6 chances in that. He also ran riot in a game against Estonia as well, playing behind Alexander Isak and Victor Gyökeres. I mean, what a trio to lead Sweden forward, having relied on Ibrahimovic for so long, for so many previous years. But I really do want Kulusevski to take a step up, because although he ranked 4th for passes into the box in the Premier League last year, only 4 assists. I think he can really up those numbers, and I think he's a player that I prefer watching than Brennan Johnson as well on that right hand side. I mean, Nick, are you kind of with me that I know you're an Arsenal fan, but you can see so much quality in Kulusevski, and do you feel like he needs to deliver bigger numbers if Spurs are to get top 4 this year?
Yeah, I think that is the frustration with him, isn't it, for Spurs fans? Just the end product. He does so much well. He's got so many good attributes, but yeah, as you say, he's not really delivered the numbers of goals and assists you would like. I mean, the other thing about him that is so impressive is he's just such a workhorse, such an athlete. In terms of like distance, he's always right at the top in terms of distance covered. He gets through so much work off the ball, pressing, attacking runs as well. There's a lot of fluidity and movement in that Spurs front line, and he's a big part of that. Yeah, I really like him. I mean, he's a player I like watching. I like watching him sort of barrel through midfield and picking up the ball in those little pockets in the number 10 position or out wide and charging forward with it. It's just a case of, adding those numbers. And that is ultimately what these attacking players are judged on, isn't it? The goals and assists. And I mean, he will acknowledge that as well. I'm sure that he'll want to get those numbers up, but a great player and someone I do enjoy watching.
Yeah, absolutely. And we saw an amazing assist for Basuma before the international break as well, with that amazing finish from him.
Yeah, I think I guess like just coming onto a point you were making, back onto a point you were making earlier, I do think that in this Spurs setup he could already has been a little bit of a victim of his own versatility. I think some of the best football we saw from him last year was when he was filling in for the injured James Maddison.
To avoid talking about a third consecutive right winger, let's move on to Mikey. Who's your next suggestion?
So my next suggestion, I was thinking about Man City this season, and obviously they've kicked off the campaign so well. And And there are a number of players who there were question marks in this City squad going into the campaign. I mean, obviously Erling Haaland, we're not going to speak about him today, but he's obviously started the season a lot better than he did last year. I think about Rico Lewis. It feels like maybe this is the year of Rico Lewis. He stepped into midfield so well this term as well. And another example of Pep really slowly bedding in an academy product, similar to what we saw kind of with Phil Foden in his early days. Also thinking about a player like Savio, who, came in with a lot of expectation, but wasn't necessarily expected to start the season, playing on the right as well, which he didn't play for Girona last year. And he's looked absolutely excellent too. But I thought Mateo Kovacic, I just think he's had a really, really impressive start to the season. And I think he's a player who's always had a point to prove, weirdly. And he shouldn't have, because he's 30 years old now. He's a 4-time Champions League winner, over 100 caps for Croatia, reached the World Cup final with them in 2018. But I think he's just always been quite a difficult player to categorise. He's a great dribbler, but he doesn't have huge ball carrying numbers. He's a great progressive passer, but he's not much of a creator. He's certainly not much of a goal scorer, although he did score, of course, a great goal against Chelsea on the opening day. But I was having a look into it. The last time he hit double figures for total goal involvements in a league campaign, he was 17 years old at Dinamo Zagreb back in 2012, which just goes to show how little he has contributed in terms of goals and assists over the years. And I think also the fact that he never quite made it at Real Madrid as a regular starter, although he was up against, of course, Toni Kroos, Luka Modric and Casemiro to get into that midfield. It was always going to be very, very difficult for him. I think has contributed to this narrative around Kovacic where, on his day, he is like a world-class looking midfielder, but fans, I think he's always been a little bit underrated in that sense. And when he came to City last year for fairly decent money, given his age, I think we thought, he's kind of perfect for a City team, high possession, he's a real technician. He looks lovely on the ball. He's so good on the turn, great dribbler, of course.
But then I suppose he was replacing Gundogan, who had such a decisive role in so many title run-ins, which is just not Kovacic's game.
Massive. And Gundogan, unlike Kovacic, can pop up in the box. He does have that kind of utility man ability where, Pep can kind of fit him into any tactical style that he wants to play. And Kovacic, well, until now, wasn't able to do that, I don't think. I think he always needed the system to work for him. And that's why I think he thrived quite well in his early days at Chelsea, where Frank Lampard was playing, a more possession style of football, quite high pressing. He was able to be, that guy who kind of picked up loose balls and was able to drive. But I think Kovacic, himself last year said, I wish I'd been coached by Pep earlier in my career. And I think a year on, that coaching from Pep is really starting to pay dividends. Of course, Rodri hasn't played a minute of football yet this season for Manchester City. Last year, I know it's, people know this stat pretty well by now, but he missed 4 games, and 3 of those games were the only games that Man City lost in the Premier League all season. He's missed 3 games so far this season, and City have won them all. And they've won them all partially because Kovacic has so far shown himself to be an excellent defensive midfielder. He's putting up over 4 tackles and interceptions a game this year, which is more than any other time in his career. Again, 3 games, small sample size, but he's been making those tackles because he's playing that role. And, it was reported over the summer that he has actually been studying particularly kind of videos to help him improve his defensive positioning. Again, alongside Rico Lewis, who, is obviously technically superb, but is a very inexperienced player, played a lot of minutes at right back for City as well, which I still feel like could be where he shifts to with Kyle Walker not getting any younger. But he has deputised for Rodri so well. I think he ranks in the top 10 in the Premier League for tackles, dribbles, passes into the final third, and goal creating actions, which shows just how great he's been in every phase of play. And given, his high tackle numbers, despite City, consistently dominating the ball. I think they had 75% possession against Ipswich. I think that's really, really remarkable. And yes, it's Pep Guardiola, it's Manchester City. Like, in 3 games' time, we may well see Kovacic on the bench with Rodri back in the side, because that's just what happens in Pep teams. Unless you are Rodri, unless you're Haaland, You know, that there's very few players who start every single game, but I just don't think he could have done much more to deserve a regular starting spot in this team. I think he was Rodri's most used kind of partner last year, but then you had Akanji, you had Stones, you had Bernardo Silva even filling in there. Gundogan will, of course, be looking for minutes in that area of the pitch as well and has deputised as a six before, but I kind of think, you know, he already has been incredibly important to Manchester City. You know, they've got off to such a flyer, and before the season, you know, there's always going to be talk of like who's going to be the Rodri backup. Well, you can't really find a Rodri backup on the market because sixes are so rare.
And who wants to do that role?
Who wants to do that role? Like you have, if you're going to buy a six, who's good enough for Manchester City, you've got to pay upwards of £60 million, and they're going to want to start. So I think his adaptation to this role, and obviously you have to give Guardiola credit for that as well, because there's no doubt that this has been his plan, has been brilliant. And I think, yeah, I can't think of a player more deserving of having success and playing a decisive role in this Manchester City team than Kovacic.
Yeah, absolutely. Good to see Mateo Nunes as well provide a really nice assist in their previous game before the international break. Both players had issues in their first season, I think it's fair to say. So that classics of second season improvement under Pep might be happening again. Nick, let's return to the right wing position, because you wanted to talk about a Chelsea youngster that is not only shone for Chelsea so far this season, but provided an assist for England last night.
Yeah, Noni Madueke. Yeah. He's I mean, there's a lot of competition in that Chelsea forward line this season, isn't there? Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, got Jadon Sancho added to the group. Joao Felix, Pedro Neto's come in. Already got Cole Palmer, of course, Mykhailo Mudryk, Christopher and Nkunku as well. So a long list of players there. But I do think Madueke could potentially establish himself and have a good season. You know, he maybe hasn't delivered consistently since coming to Chelsea, but he is someone with a real capacity to affect games, and I think that the England game is an example. You know, he comes on his debut, he gets an assist for Kane's second goal, and that is quite typical of him. You know, we saw it at PSV as well. He went there from Spurs as a very young player. They didn't, you know, they used him fairly sparingly. They kind of bedded him in quite slowly, but he was really effective. So in the 2020-21 season, he got 7 goals and 4 assists in only 960 minutes in the Eredivisie at Chelsea as well. I mean, if you look at his numbers as a whole, it's sort of 13 goals, 3 assists in only 2,500 minutes. So he is contributing a lot. And he does have that knack for doing that. He does affect things. And I think that's a really valuable trait for an attacking player. I spoke to actually a guy called Saul Isaacson-Hurst when he arrived at Chelsea initially. And Saul is a guy who works as like a technical and individual skills coach with a lot of sort of Premier League footballers. He works individually with them in the off season or maybe during international breaks, and he's worked a lot with Madueke over the years, and he was really positive on him. He described him as one of the best young forward players in Europe, if not the best, which at the time, you know, given we hadn't seen a huge amount of him in England, and you know, we'd probably seen clips from PSV, you know, that did feel like a big statement. But I do think he has that level of potential. You know, I think we are starting to see that as well. One thing that this coach talked about was his super skill being to kind of cut in from the right side and shoot on his left foot, you know, in that kind of Arjen Robben way that a lot of those kind of inverted wingers like to do. But he also talked about how much they worked on him going on the outside as well, and developing that ability to go on the outside and use his right foot. And that is something you now see in his game. So I think one of the things that can help him at Chelsea is the fact that he can do both. You know, he can potentially play on both sides. He can cause a threat in different ways. And you know, we saw that with the hat-trick he scored against Wolves. So 2 of those 3 goals, although they all came from a similar position, 2 of them were on his right foot, which is his weaker foot, and only 1 was on his left foot. And if you look at his goals as a whole at Chelsea, of the 13, he has scored 4 with his right, 7 with his left. So you know, he does have that ability to score on both feet. Very quick, very good one-on-one, and also his work rate is impressive, you know, defensively. I was at a Chelsea game last season when they beat Tottenham at Stamford Bridge 2-0, and Madueke played, and afterwards it was quite interesting that Mauricio Pochettino really made a point, kind of unprompted, of praising Madueke for his defensive work rate. And he talked about how, you know, it's not about big names, it's about the job you do on the pitch. And I think in that game, Madueke had been helping to protect Alfie Gilchrist, or maybe one of his first appearances for Chelsea. So, he's got that side to him as well. And Isaacson Hurst described him as a mentality monster in terms of the amount he wants to learn and how he wants to progress. There was that incident with the penalty, wasn't there, last season?
Where he tried to get involved a bit.
Which he didn't make him look great, and there was the silly comment he made about Wolverhampton recently. These are things, these are the things that stick in people's minds, though, aren't they? These little slip-ups from young players, but I don't think they kind of accurately reflect his character. And certainly in terms of his ability, he's got loads of talent. So I think he could really make his mark this season.
Do you think, again, we spoke about Jadon Sancho earlier, given the money spent on Pedro Neto, given that Mudryk is, still a pretty prominent member of that forward line as well, and then Noni Madueke's start to the season, I don't know, I do worry a little bit that Jadon Sancho might not get that many chances in this forward line.
Yeah, I do. I kind of feel the same. You can say the same for a number of the players because ultimately there's so many of them and they're all going to want to play consistently and it's going to be difficult for that to happen. Yeah, I do worry with Sancho that the thing he needs is consistent football, and I'm just not convinced he's going to get it necessarily at Chelsea. And that is a concern because his minutes played, I think, have declined sort of every season since his first full year at Dortmund. And I think it's a slightly odd move for him to make in terms of trying to get a regular spot, just when there's so much competition. So yeah, it's going to be tricky for Maresca as well to balance that because all these guys have come in for big fees. They're all going to want to play, and it's not easy to have to juggle them and keep them all happy.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like particularly Mykhailo Mudryk as well. Just does feel like the final 12 months of his Chelsea career, unless there's a serious upturn in form. I think he's shown some really, really promising glimpses, but there's just so much poor decision-making in there at the same time as well. He's a very frustrating player, in my opinion. Let's move away from the sort of super clubs, as it were, and to a club that many people were expecting to have an excellent season. I think they had quite a destabilising summer in Crystal Palace. Haven't got off to the start they would have wanted whatsoever. But one signing that did really catch my eye in the summer was Daichi Kamada. 28-year-old attacking midfielder striker, can also play out wide, but he's playing as one of those dual 10s in Ole Glasner's 3-4-3 at the moment, which puts a lot of attacking responsibility and width responsibility on Tyreek Mitchell on the left-hand side and Munoz on the right-hand side, because Eze and Kamada are not the most natural wide players in particular. But this is why it's quite an exciting signing in that he does have experience of really thriving under Ole Glasner as well. I think they had 2 full seasons together at Eintracht Frankfurt. That was during the time that they won the Europa League. And during his time at Frankfurt as well, he was constantly having to say goodbye to teammates that had been really effective in forward areas. Not just Jovic and Haller, but also Ante Rebic had a good couple of seasons there. Filip Kostic was their main creative force for a number of years. Andre Silva had a great couple of years, goal-scoring wise for Frankfurt as well. So that was a little bit troubling, but given that whole period, he was pretty consistent. 40 goals and 33 assists, 0.4 goal contributions per game across his whole time at Eintracht Frankfurt, which, given the fact he cost 2.5 million euros from the J-League, was an amazing return on investment. And it took a loan spell going to Sint-Truiden, I think that's how you pronounce it, in Belgium. It might actually be the Flemish side.
Great Belgian pronunciation.
Yeah, good.
I don't know, but it sounded good.
Well, yeah, that's part of the battle, isn't it? But then towards the end of the season before last, he decided not to renew his contract. Eintracht Frankfurt, were very keen to keep him. He goes off to Lazio, and it was just a really, really bad year for Lazio. They signed 10 players that summer. There was a clear disconnect between what Maurizio Sarri, their then manager, and Claudio Lotito, their owner/chairman, who takes a very active role, as so many Italian presidents do, in the running of their club. And none of the signings really hit the ground running. Like Tati Castellanos was one of their main signings, very much firing in bits and parts. They also lost Sergei Milinkovic-Savic that summer. So there's real pressure on Daichi Kamada, who had performed really well in Europe before, in the Europa League, for Eintracht Frankfurt, to be their kind of new talisman, especially because they were moving away from Ciro Immobile. But it really didn't materialise. He only started 8 league games before Maurizio Sarri was fired in March. He was replaced by Igor Tudor, who's now left the club in the summer. Lazio is one of those clubs that they do just churn through managers. They don't have the best record in terms of convincing managers to stay. It's a bit like a sort of Marseille of Italy. But Kamada, it's fair to say, didn't show his best form either. 2 goals and 2 assists in 36 games in the league and Champions League. A lot of those off the bench. Maurizio Sarri said publicly, there's so much talent in there, but we haven't really unlocked it yet. And in the summer, he makes the decision to go back and team up with Ole Glasner, who's now at Crystal Palace, obviously. And so far, it hasn't really fired in the league at least, but I think he did have an excellent game in the League Cup. I was watching that game a few weeks ago, or at least the highlights of which. Goal and assist in that game looked really, really promising. And they need him to start firing, because only Ipswich and Leicester have created less XG than Crystal Palace so far. And at the moment, it does feel like too much of the Eze show, who I think has started the season firing shots off from all areas. And I think it just feels so much more attacking responsibility on his shoulders on the back of Michael Olise leaving. But I am excited for Daichi Kamada to hopefully get going in the next 4 games, at least in the league as well, because they do have a favourable run of fixture. They've got Leicester, QPR in the Cup, Man United and Everton. And so hopefully the Crystal Palace that we expected to see in the summer, Mike, he can start sort of coming into focus.
Yeah, I guess the question is, what does a good season look like for Palace at this point? Because, yeah, there was a bit of upheaval in the summer, but they still kept hold of key players, like Adam Wharton, I think will be priced out of the market at least for the next 12 months, you'd expect, but like keeping hold of Eze. Yeah, I think, I don't know, there was such high expectations. There was almost too, I think the expectations were almost too high after like Glasner finished the way that Glasner finished last season, because it was a fairly short amount of time. It was the only time that a Palace manager had Eze and Olise to be able to call upon without either being injured for so long. And so, I don't know, it feels like there is already quite a bit of pressure on someone like Kamada, like playing under, a coach that he's familiar with, to be able to make like a massive difference in the final third. And like we saw at Lazio, when you're in a slightly different system, it's not always going to necessarily work out. And yes, Glasner's done a great job at Palace, but it's not the same as Frankfurt. Like he was, I think some of the best football I saw Kamada play was, as a proper left winger, cutting in and shooting there. And that's not the role that he's playing here. I think he does have to do more legwork and facilitate someone like Eze. So I think he's, in some ways, I know he's very experienced at this point, Kamada, but he's been thrown in the deep end a little bit. He's got a great midfield behind him, but yeah, I don't know whether we're going to see fireworks from Kamada this season. I'd love to be proven wrong, but I feel like he's kind of got to work for the team more than himself.
Okay, there we have it. Will he prove us wrong? We're not so sure. Well, at least Mikey's not. I think he could be great, but let's wait and see for more evidence, hopefully coming in the next few weeks. Nick, where do you want to go next?
Well, who have I got lastly? My third pick was Chris Wood. Actually.
Nice.
Yes. Chris Wood.
He gets regularly mentioned on the Lowdown. We are big Chris Wood fans.
I think he might be the most talked about player of this show so far this season. It's pretty mad, but I mean, for good reason, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Forest obviously tried to sign Eddie Nketiah in the summer. From Arsenal. He's a very, very good striker. I'm sure he'll do well at Palace, but it would be no surprise to me if Wood scores more goals for Forest this year than Nketiah scores for Palace. I think that's just what he has done over the course of his career. He scores goals reliably. You think about this weekend's game between Forest and Liverpool. If you look at all the players in that game and look at actual goals scored since the start of last season, Chris Wood is level with Mohamed Salah for non-penalty goals with 16 since the start of last season.
That's a great stat.
Which I've been telling everyone downstairs that stat all morning. That isn't unusual, though, for Chris Wood, really. I mean, before I move on, though, we'll talk about his minutes as well. So in that period, he hasn't always been starting consistently since the start of last season. So if you actually take it from a sort of a goals per minutes basis, he's third in the league behind only Erling Haaland and Diogo Jota in terms of goals scored per goals minutes per goal scored excluding penalties. So it gives you an idea of just how effective and how efficient he is. And he's done this for a long time. As I said, double figures for Premier League goals in 5 of the last 7 seasons.
That's amazing.
Only Salah, Son and Harry Kane have done so more times. He's level with Sadio Mane, Jamie Vardy, Raheem Sterling in the same time frame. 65 non-penalty goals since the start of 2017-18, behind only 6 players.
Pretty amazing, given he was playing in that Sean Dyche Burnley team for so long, where chances came at a real premium. He was not getting the kind of service that someone like Mane was getting, or Sterling, or even Kane. Yeah.
I mean, he's obviously a player with his certain limitations. He's a target man. He's great in the air. He's great in the box. He's not going to do other things for you, things that maybe Eddie Nketiah would do, for example. But he's so effective, and he's not a glamorous option necessarily. But I do think he's underappreciated. Not necessarily by Forest fans. I think they appreciate how effective he is, and probably fans of his previous clubs or most of his previous clubs would say that as well. But you have to remember as well the importance of a lot of these goals he scores. He does score really important goals. So I asked Opta this morning actually to give me rankings of points won by goals since the start of last season, and these are, if you take these goals away, where would it leave the team? Chris Wood's goals count for 13 points for Forest since the start of last season, which is the 5th highest of any Premier League player, behind only Haaland, Solanke, Palmer and Ollie Watkins. So Forest would have gone down without him last season for sure. He's already
Nick, you're on fire with these Chris Wood stats.
I know.
This is great stuff.
Sort of become obsessed with Chris Wood.
Aren't you all? Aren't we all even?
Crucial goals, and he's at it again this season. His 2 goals this season have got Forest draws. I think there's a bigger point as well here. Like I think basically he would solve a lot of problems for a lot of teams, sort of outside maybe the top 6, top 8 in the Premier League. I think about some of the other teams in that relegation battle last season, the ones who went down. So Burnley, for example, and Sheffield United. So Sheffield United spent 18 million on Cameron Archer, who's obviously a very good young player, but he scored 4 goals for them over the course of the season. I mean, you're talking about a guy who's never really done it in the Premier League. You're putting so much pressure on him to expect him to come in and score regularly. Same at Burnley. They paid a lot of money for Zeki Amdouni. They signed Lyle Foster, I think 6 months before that. Both those players sort of 12-15 million pound signings, younger guys, lots of potential, but again they didn't deliver goals in the Premier League because it's such a challenge to do that. There are so few players who can reliably do that. Now the idea with buying these players for these clubs is obviously you buy them young, they accrue more value, and you can potentially sell them for a profit. You get a longer run out of them. But there's so much to be said, especially when you're at that end of the table, for a player who can come in and reliably deliver goals. Obviously Burnley wanted to play in a certain way, and maybe Chris Wood didn't fit into that. But, if they'd had Chris Wood, who cost Nottingham Forest £15 million, they could still be in the Premier League. I do think that's an interesting one. There's so much emphasis these days on signing young players, build up young players. But there's a lot to be said for players who can deliver like Chris Wood has for a long, long period of time. What value, amazing value for money for Forest, 15 million a couple of seasons ago. Great signing, and I think he'll do it again this year, I'm sure.
Do you know what's been dominating social media this week is that Barclays man trend? And Chris Wood is tailor-made.
He would have been a Barclays man. I was thinking that exact thought earlier, actually.
Get the comps made, guys. Get the comps made. I'll promise to retweet it. Right. Mikey, finally, let's talk about a player that I'm quite surprised you wanted to talk about, because I thought he was excellent last year.
He was excellent last year, but again, I feel like I've had a bit of a trend with this of kind of players who've maybe been mischaracterised over the years, or at least with Joao Pedro at Brighton, who I'm going to speak about very briefly now. It does feel like maybe this will be his year. Like, yes, he's very, very highly rated. He showed great level for Brighton last year, but he's played, generally at centre forward for many years now. First at Watford and now at Brighton. Obviously, went there for over 30 million euros last year from Watford. But he's still yet to put up double figures for goals in a top flight campaign. A huge proportion of his goals last year came from the spot. I think it was 4 goals were penalties in the Premier League of his 9. 4 of his 6 goals in the Europa League were also penalties as well. But his non-penalty XG was quite high, 0.35, although, still not really at an elite level. You really need to be getting up to, over 0.5 really as a top level striker, and especially in a Brighton side that do tend to create quite good quality chances under De Zerbi and now under Huertzler. But I feel like this season maybe we've seen him in the position that he will thrive in long term, because he was always good picking up space on the left. He's a good dribbler. He's very strong. Amazingly, last year he was actually winning more aerial duels or having a better success rate with his aerial duels than Lewis Dunk, which is pretty bad for a striker. Usually you back the centre-back. Your centre-backs tend to come out on top in aerial duels. And Joao Pedro was winning more of them. I think he scored 3 goals with his head in the league as well. So brilliant in the air.
He was great in the Europa League as well.
Yeah, so he's actually a really well-rounded attacker. But there's always going to be questions of you when you're not producing tons of goals as a centre-forward. And this year under Huertzler, so far we've seen him play a little bit deeper, play as kind of a second striker to Danny Welbeck, almost play as a little bit of a number 10 as well. And I just think that the freedom that gives him, without taking away from having a focal point in the attack, I just think could take Brighton to the next level. You know, we've spoken a lot about the depth that they have in attack, but so far this season, every single game, it's been Matoma, Welbeck and Joao Pedro, and then Minter on the right starting, and they've looked absolutely amazing. You know, I think, you know, I don't know, Minter's obviously gone off like a rocket. You know, his ability to outmuscle Gabriel for Arsenal and you know, produce the save that then leads to Joao Pedro's equaliser in that game. I think he's looked absolutely brilliant. But I think Joao Pedro at 22, he's turning 23 this month. I think we could finally see him come alive. You know, scored against Man United already, the 95th minute winner. Obviously, he scored that equaliser against Arsenal. You know, like you say with Chris Wood, he's already won Brighton 4 points. So I think, yeah, that ability to be decisive and also that ability to be able to link up play and dribble past players, you know, in and around the box. With Danny Welbeck, he's obviously started great as well to kind of aim for. I think he's produced more passes into the penalty area than anyone else in this Brighton squad so far this year. Yeah, I think he could have a really, really special season.
I think he could as well. 20 goals last year for Joao Pedro. I think it was a brilliant campaign that kind of went under the radar at Brighton last year. But guys, that is all we've got time for on the Lowdown this week. I hope you guys enjoyed the show. Which of our suggestions do you think is most likely to prove you wrong this season? Get your thoughts in the comments section and we'll catch you next week. Bye-bye.